Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 27th of November 2023, sponsored by the 1974 Canadian football team, because, why not? I have not done a Frontline update for a couple of days. I didn't do one yesterday just because, it was Sunday and real life took over. It's quite funny because the typical, pro-Russians in my thread, pro-Kremlin voices, Nikos G and Pom G and whatever their names are, were like, oh, I see you're not doing a Frontline update because it's all going badly. I was like, I don't know what's going on because I've not done a Frontline update, which means I'm not going to put in all this research into finding out what's going on because I don't have time to do it. So whatever. And I don't particularly think anything grand happened yesterday. So whatever is my answer to that. Anyway, let's go and see broadly what has happened. And I was thinking that not too much is going to happen because the weather was looking increasingly dodgy yesterday. And indeed, it was pretty terrible. So I was thinking, if I'm going to not do a Frontline update, yesterday was a good day for that. Let's pop in to see what Kenneth Gregg, the Finnish fighter who's in Ukraine, has to say. Is a general roundup, but a lot of it is dependent on just open source data. The Russians have now moved everything they have to Avdiivka for a final attempt, he says, including the 239th Tank Regiment. Furthermore, some regiments have been moved closer together. Probably a concentrated attempt will be made to bring in a spearhead. We have also strengthened with loitering munitions and anti-tank and artillery. We see some of the same tendency north of Klishchiivka, while we are doing the same thing southwest of Robotyne and on the occupied shore of Dnipro. So right now there are preparations by both sides. There is information that the US and Germany will force the Ukrainian government into peace talks by not delivering the promised weapons just so we can hold the line. The Ukrainian people will not accept a peace where the Russians can keep what they have occupied, or a peace that only postpones the military settlement by 5 to 9 years. It is not only a pure political disaster, it's also an economic disaster. Who wants to invest in a country that is guaranteed to be reinvaded when the Russian country considers itself strong enough? So I just want to answer that. I haven't reported on this for the last, I don't know how long ago it came out. Let's have a look. So 24th, it was about 3 days ago. So this was in the Bild newspaper. Now, just to let you know, Bild is a proper tabloid sensationalist newspaper in Germany, a mix of gossip, inflammatory language and sensationalism. And I think the article needs to be taken in that context, especially as it was written by Julian Röpke, who is not the greatest source of people, from what I can gather from what most others say about him. So quite often, even as pro-Ukraine, quite often very much looks to be adopting a kind of pro-Russian line sometimes. I say quite often, sometimes. At some points, it's difficult to know exactly where his sentiments lie. But nonetheless, he's produced this article in the Bild, which is talking about how the West are going to force Ukraine to do peace talks, so on and so forth. And a lot of people actually met that article with a good degree of skepticism. Some people were asking me in the threads about that article or quoting from it, and I didn't report it because I didn't think it particularly warranted it. But nonetheless, it is mentioned there, so take it for what it is. Anyway, Kenneth Gregg continues, drone warfare on the front lines will determine the war if our military aid runs out. The various frontline battalions have realised this long ago, and preparations to do something have begun. Many battalions have authorised volunteers whose task is to find solutions for equipment and items classified as weapons. The 23rd Battalion has a drone squad that provides the data the battalion needs to eliminate 50 to 100 Russians per day in Bakhmut. We have found a young Norwegian drone expert who is on his way here to see if his invention can help. The preliminary information bodes well, and this type of drone is not available on the front line. So it is interesting. So these are things that certain groups are doing on their own backs. I'm going to leave him there as he goes on to talk about other things. Now let's go to the Institute for the Study of War, and we're going to start in the northeastern axis. That is the Kupiansk to Crimea to Svatova axis up here And as you can see, not a great deal of change to that front line. There is this rejig that is actually a couple of days old now. I didn't report it yesterday because I didn't do a video. One thing I had noted was a rejig that Andrew Perpetua had, and this wasn't so much. It's quite a bit of land, but he's like, I'm pretty sure that was Russian held, but I was just waiting for some info, and it was Russian held. So it wasn't as a result of a Russian counterattack or anything. So I think it's sort of quite a big bit of land like that, something like that. Other than that, fairly positional, it seems, along that line. The ISW says of the area, a couple of interesting observations that they report on. Ukrainian Ground Forces spokesperson Fitio reported that Russian forces have intensified their use of loitering munitions and first-person view drones near Sinkivka in attempts to advance towards Kupiansk. So that's interesting because it is a case of using more drones up in that northeastern area by Sinkivka there. Drones really are becoming the crucial component of this war for so many reasons. And we're also seeing the Russians having an increased number of drones. And so their capacity to do this drone warfare has increased a lot recently. There are Lancet drones have now picked up again with thermal imaging on some of their drones as well. So they are getting much more success with hitting Ukrainians in the nighttime too. The second observation here is a Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces attempted to seize the initiative in the Serebyansky forest over the past week by taking advantage of Russian troop deployment from the area to other unspecified directions. So we had heard actually that from the Liman direction, I think there were troops being sent either to Bakhmut or to Avdiivka, I can't quite remember, but that would, as ever with these robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you're going to get your reserves from front lines, which we talked about as taking place potentially in the Dnipro River area where their reserves are arguably coming, so at least some of them seem to be coming from the Robotyne area, which then leaves Robotyne short for the Russians, and that allows an opportunity for the Ukrainians to have some more success there. That happens up and down the line, and that talks to the claim of there being no strength in depth for the Russians, really struggling to get those reserves. Russian mill bloggers have routinely claimed in recent weeks that Ukrainian forces are preparing to launch a localized offensive effort near Crimea. I mean, I have no idea whether this is even remotely true. You quite often hear these rumors from both sides because we hear that the Russians are getting ready for an attack in the north, an attack around Crimea themselves. And so, on the one hand, Russia are gearing for an attack here, and on the other hand, the Ukrainians are gearing for an attack there. So, I don't know, take your pick. But also take most of your food around here with a pinch of salt. Okay, we'll come on to Bakhmut. I have no sources for that northeast and none for Bakhmut either. And as you can see, there are no changes to the territory around Bakhmut. It is still fairly tough around there for both sides. The ISW reports the Ukrainian General Staff saying that their forces continue conducting assaults north of Bakhmut and are inflicting personnel and military equipment losses on Russian forces. So the kind of positive outlook for the Ukrainians going on the attack in the north, not something we've seen too much of over the last month or two. It's been concentrated for the south with the Ukrainians, and the Russians themselves have had more success in the north, particularly around Kromova and Bakhmut here and Bodanivka towards Chaziv Yar. But yes, as for anything else, I mean, the ISW talks quite a bit about that which is going on around Klishivka, but there's no real changes. Repelled attacks, each side claiming, well, particularly Russians claiming some gains here and there, but just no confirmation of those. So we come on to Avdiivka, and I've got a lot of sources for Avdiivka. There's a lot to be said about it because it is kind of the main crux of the entire front line as far as the Russians are concerned. And as you can see, a number of red pointers here, markers on the map, which of course reminds me that I haven't yet given you the key to what my map means. So if you've never seen my videos before, please pause the video to check out what the different lines on my map mean. We're going to delve into them right now. Okay, so in this northern area, you can see that Andrew Perpetua has some gains for the Russians west of Krasnohorivka, but the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back a little bit, sort of south of Stepova, between there and the coke plant. And Suryat maps has engaged the Russians towards the coke plant. We'll go through the pins first before we actually... as we're in Avdiivka, just to let you know that there is activity still in Horlivka, just no change there, but there are claims that both sides have sort of attacked each other in that area, where there are those tailings or spoil heaps, or indeed slag heaps, whatever takes your fancy. So as we come down around the this bowl that Avdiivka sits in, as far as the front line is concerned, around Kamyanka and Vesely here, no change to the mapping from either side, but then there's a lot of activity in this southern industrial area where Suryat maps has some gains near the it's not near the filtration plant, is it? It's the filtration plant. Where are you? I'm getting myself confused. Anyway, yes, the filtration plant's there. So it's south of there. So, yeah, some gains over the other side of the highway for the Russians, as according to Suryat maps, and then some, well, really claiming that the Russians have total control over the industrial areas, certainly to the north, maybe not so much in the middle and to the south here, but the Yazinivska Street is what's often talked about. Andrew Perpetua has some Ukrainian gains. Whether that's a rejigging of the map as opposed to a counterattack, I don't know. And then some Russian gains further in, just below that, in the building area. So 6 and 1/2 dozen the other just there. And then Perpetua has some gains for the Russians further to the south of the industrial area. And as we come towards sort of Vodyane there, and Opitny and Vodyane towards there, in the southwest. So quite a lot of activity, quite a lot of change. However, JR was saying this morning, he's done a mapping for me. Thank you so much, mate. He was saying that actually there's quite a bit of simplification around here. So it might not be that they're gains, but it's just that there's a lot of jaggedy lines, as it was almost like too accurate. And so it just takes a long time to map. And I don't know if Suryat Maps has just simplified certain areas which look like gains here and there, but aren't necessarily gains. So there are some changes that might not be pinned there. Anyway, let's look at some of the different claims concerning Avdiivka. We'll go first to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. Russian forces made confirmed advances northwest and southeast, the two areas we looked at, of Avdiivka yesterday. Geolocated footage published yesterday shows that the Russians have marginally advanced northwest of Krasnohorivka and in the eastern part of the industrial zone on Avdiivka's southeastern outskirts. So those two geolocations were these here that the ISW is referring to. So the Ukrainians shelling the Russians north of Krasnohorivka. So this is the Russian position being shelled. So we'll see where that is, if my fingers actually work correctly. There we go. And we'll plug that in and see what the map has to say. Okay, so that suggests that the Russians are pushed out to where both mappers have them, and that does, I mean, Andrew Perpetua here has that as a gain. I think Suryat Map had that as a previous gain, so Suryat Map is probably correct in showing that gain, and that evidence has then come to Andrew, who has then mapped that in accordance with Suryat. So that's good that they both agree. And then we have another one here, which I'm not quite sure what this tells me, because this is a Google Translate or a Bing Translate. Active hostilities in the industrial zone. Attack of the Russian armed forces by armored vehicles in the direction of the position of the armed forces of Ukraine in the northern part of the industrial zone. Shelling the position of the armed forces of Ukraine from a short distance. So the firing position and a firing sector. So this is where the Russians, as far as I can work out what that means, this is where the Russians are firing from. This will be in the, so they are firing from in this area that they have gained, as according to Suryat Maps. And this perhaps is where they are firing to, but it might be the other way around. We'll see whether this makes sense with the geolocation here. I like to do this live with you and then surprise myself No, so yeah, just really close. So I don't know if those are two separate things. Then I don't know what the translation is doing with that. Firing position, firing sector. It could just be that's where they're firing on rather than from, in which case that's where the Ukrainians are. Quite difficult to make sense of that. So that's a bit of a not too sure there, but certainly the one near Krasnohorivka shows a Russian advance. And then if we continue, geolocated video shows Russian armoured vehicles attacking Ukrainian positions in the northern part of the industrial area on Avdiivka's southeastern outskirts, and that's what that was about as well. Russian mill bloggers overwhelmingly claim that Russian forces captured the entire industrial area near the Yazynyurvata 2 railway station on November the 26th after clearing the last remaining buildings in the area on the 25th, but ISW has not confirmed that. So this is Yazynyurvata around there, so it's these kind of areas going in this direction, I would have thought. As far as a railway station is concerned, not 100% sure where that is. That's going to be further down here. That's the railway line. So I don't know if that just means, the whole lot of that. Some people are claiming, it's been claimed for a number of days that the Russians have complete control over that. It doesn't seem to be true, but they are increasing their control over that area, and it is a concern for the Ukrainians for sure. Right, Rebar said, so the pro-Russian source said that by Saturday evening, Russian troops had liberated an industrial zone southwest of Avdiivka, so they say liberated it, which the enemy had held since 2014. The captured facility is on a high ground, which will facilitate a further assault of Avdiivka itself. Meanwhile, fierce fighting is taking place on the northern flank of Avdiivka near the coke plant. Russian forces have somewhat expanded the zone of control, but it's not yet come under a full-fledged assault. Talking about this area here, particularly this industrial zone, if you watch a reporting from Ukraine's video, they say, or he says, that essentially the Ukrainians pulled out of that area, and that left it, it was an operational withdrawal, and that left it under control of the Russians. And then that allowed the Ukrainians supposedly to hit the Russians from 3 different sides. And that because the buildings have been thoroughly destroyed by the Russians themselves with artillery and mortars and guided glide bombs over the last few weeks, this is now not a great place to hang out. And the Ukrainians pulling out there has actually allowed them to properly hammer the Russians in that position. So the claim from reporting from Ukraine is almost like they've lured the Russians into that area and then are hitting the Russians really hard. I can't talk to the accuracy of those claims, but it seems fairly plausible. It's being opportunistic in an operational withdrawal. If that's the case, it's like, okay, we're under the cosh here. It's not a good place to hang out. There's not a lot of places to hide, but we do have a lot of fortifications in the forest area around here, and certainly down in this area. So we can still hammer the Russians as they're in there, much more open than we are as we're in the forest. And actually, the Russians, we can take advantage of being forced out of that area by some stiff Russian attacking and hammer the Russians in the way that we were hammered when we were there. So that could well be the situation in that southeastern area. So Global War Monitor here saying of the northwest that Russia's crossed the railway north of the town of Krasnohorivka, and a couple of areas of gain for the Russians there. So we're going to go back to the north. That's actually in this area, and then over here as well. And Syriac maps over the last few days. So this is going back a couple of days. You can see the 25th there. This is situation at Avdiivka from the northern axis. The Russian army made small advances in the tree line adjacent to the coke plants, and the Russian army took full control over the industrial area as the Ukrainian army withdrew from the northern part of the Yazynyurvata, as they say it, Yazynovatsky Avenue. So some success for the Russians by the coke plants, but that was one and a half days ago, and then further success there, as on my map. And then they went on to say that after the capture of the industrial zone, the next objective for the Russian army would be the capture of the Vinogradniki quarries and farms from where they can monitor the Ukrainian movements in the forest zone. Precisely, the penetration into the urban zone will continue to be reduced by taking new parts of the Yazyanovatsky Avenue, from where to establish fire control over the lower part that divides the city. Obviously, a bit butchered English here. Simultaneously, the Russian troops will seize the forest zone, reaching the rear of the Ukrainian defences along the H20 in order to achieve the solid control over the Donetsk filtration station. However, as previously stated, the Russian advance will be difficult due to the large number of defences in this forest zone, and a collapse of the forces is not expected as long as the northern front does not make progress. So partly I kind of wish list for Suriyat maps really. But they are right in saying that the Ukrainians do have a lot of fortifications in this forest area, and it will be difficult for the Russians to make quick progress through there. I mean, you only have to look at Serebryensky Forest to know how difficult it is fighting through these forested areas, especially when there are, series of fortifications and dugouts to stop that from happening. So it might be harder for the Russians going forward, but they do have momentum on their side, and they have had some success in the southeastern corner. And then Suriyat Maps' latest claim is that the Russian army has advanced north of the industrial area and along the H20 to take control over a series of Ukrainian fortifications adjacent to the forest area. So this is the idea that if we come back down here, they are advancing in this area up the highway and taking some fortifications within the forest area. We'll see how that all plays out, of course. Right. Now we're going to have a look at some footage here which just shows the sheer volume of equipment that the Russians have lost. This is South Avdiivka around Vodyane, and I'll give you the geolocation for this in a second. It's just an insane amount of equipment. Again, we know that it's been a problem, this area, but it's almost like a corridor here of broken equipment all up there, all around there, in the middle of the fields. You can see random bits here and there, over there. Just a lot of equipment lost. Now that again talks to the Russian losses in the area, as you can see from Barracuda's mapping here. A whole lot of pins to show a whole lot of broken equipment. I don't know if there's a single. No, there isn't a single point. That's by the quarry there. So this is going to be just over here in this area. That looks like it was kind of looking up there. I think possibly that video looking up this tree line. It could be that's the road there where all those vehicles are basically blown up, unless it's further over this way. But one of these roadways is just littered with destroyed vehicles. Let's have a look there. Actually, it really is around this area here. So yeah, just around there. Okay, so moving on, this is another bit of footage to see. This one, what do we have? Russian forces shelling Pervomaisky, and this has a geolocation. So, that is to say, oh, great, awesome. That is to say that the Russians are shelling the Ukrainians here. We'll see what that looks like on the map. Just confirm that Russian forces shelling Pervomaisky, and the geolocation is as follows. No, it's not. Geolocation is as follows. Why it sometimes does that. Right, so yeah, I don't think that tells us too much, but other than the Russians are hammering Pervomaisky, well, it's nothing unusual. It's been pretty flattened. We remember, I don't even remember, goodness me, it seems so long ago, where there were those tank battles that were going on in Pervomaisky between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians had quite a big sort of charge of their tanks into that area, and it reminds me a little bit of Mariinka, actually, to the degree that places are destroyed there. Anyway, that's Avdiivka for you. We're going to come down, and there's still activity in places like Novomykhailivka, here, and Mariinka, nothing too much to report. The same for Velika Novosilka. Stuff is happening along these lines, but no real changes. There's a little bit of change here, as you can see in Robotyne, where the Ukrainians, according to Andrew Perpetua, have pushed the Russians to the west towards Kopani here, or south of Kopani. So some success still for the Ukrainians. It's a sort of grinding success either here or, sometimes around Verbove. I've got no sources to discuss that other than to say if we come down here, so the ISW, a Russian mill blogger claimed on the 26th that Ukrainian forces advanced half a kilometer towards Novofedorivka and unsuccessfully tried to advance in the direction of Kopani. So that's interesting. So yesterday, ISW reports Russians saying, well, actually, the Ukrainians didn't succeed advancing this direction, but did succeed going towards Novofedorivka by about half a kilometer, if that Russian source is to be believed. I mean, I always call this enemy attestation. So when you get the other side saying that the enemy is succeeding, it's often something you take more seriously than your own side saying that. So that is exactly half a kilometer. So that would be the move of the line if they were to be believed. So possibly some Ukrainian success on that side, and possibly success over here towards Kopani. But it is slow, it is grinding, and it's no doubt expensive for the Ukrainians in terms of personnel, particularly. The mill bloggers claim that Russian forces achieved unspecified tactical successes near Novoprokopivka before heavy rainfall disrupted the active fighting. So weather is taking its toll on maneuvers in this area, as I'm sure it is up and down the front line. So coming out of Robotyne and Zaporizhia, we come into Kherson and the Dnipro River area, where there are various things to report. The ISW says Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces entered the western outskirts of Krinky. Okay, so let's go to look at Krinky, and there's been lots of talk about Krinky. Claims that the Russians have pushed back and had quite a big counterattack around here, as you can hear from that, but also claims that the Ukrainians are expanding their bridgehead here too. So there are contradictory claims. It's really interesting speaking to not only, in fact, I'm going to find it for you. I was speaking to Andrew Perpetua about this area, and actually what was mentioned was kind of confirmed a little bit by Perun. Okay, so Perun's video from Saturday, always worth watching his videos every week, says it has a whole section on the Kherson area and the Dnipro River attacks. And this was what Andrew and myself were talking about the other day, that actually it's quite a difficult area for the Russians to get access to logistically. And it could be that they failed to supply troops to this area, not so much because they've got a lack of reserves, although that could also be a big problem for them, but actually it's just logistically very difficult to get their human beings, to get their troops to Krinky, for example, or any of these places along here. It's quite a clever place to attack, because you have this area here where there is a considerable geographic issue for Russian movement. I mean, this is all pretty deserty. I mean, it really is. Like the Aleshki Sands are a proper looking desert there, and it is fairly similar all around here. So actually, it's not easy to get large amounts of troops through there. Yeah, there are a couple of roads, but these roads going along parallel to the river are essentially interdicted. The Ukrainians have fire control. They have higher ground on this side of the river. I don't know if it's worth me showing you again. It won't look too emphasized, but there is higher ground on this side. It does go up in certain of these areas. You can see kind of raises a little bit there, and so on and so forth. There are, you can see there the land goes up, whereas if you go and look the other way, it really is pretty flat going in that direction, and actually that means that the Ukrainians have an advantage in terms of height, so they can hammer, or they can get better sight over the left bank of the Kherson, and they can hammer them with artillery, given that it appears that the Ukrainians have had some success in degrading the Russian equipment around here. They've had some electronic warfare success around here, and the Ukrainian drones seem to have the advantage in this particular neck of the woods, and that is making it very difficult for the Russians, as there are only really a couple of ways to get troops to Krinky. This road here is as I say, interdicted, and then you've got forests all around here. And the road along the river, as I said, is also, fire control over that. So it might be that they're just struggling. The Russians are just struggling to get troops to Krinky from a practical point of view.
If we zoom out, however, we can make some observations about why the Ukrainians might be choosing to try and fight here. In terms of strategic and political imperative, obviously the city of Kherson is just there. Ever since Ukraine reclaimed the city, it's often come under artillery attack from Russian forces. So it stands to reason if Ukraine is able to push Russian forces several kilometres further away, then Kherson's people and valuable infrastructure will become harder to target, as shorter-ranged Russian artillery systems in particular have to get closer to the new front line in order to make those attacks. The presence of the city is also one part in the wider logistics context here. The general quality of infrastructure on the Ukrainian-controlled right bank of the river is considerably better than the quality on the Russian-controlled left bank. There are permanent roads that can be expected to handle mud season and winter relatively well, and of course Kherson itself is a major settlement with an active railway connection. That means if Ukraine wants to move units around or keep the units that are currently engaged well supplied with things like artillery ammunition, then they have a relatively simple, in comparative terms, way to do it. Obviously things get much more complicated if you want to move equipment across the river itself as opposed to just to Kherson, but the relevant infrastructure on the Russian side isn't quite so extensive. The area is basically, to use the technical term, at the arse end of the Russian logistics network. Most supplies are either going to have to transit from Russia through Zaporizhia all the way to Kherson, or come up from Crimea. And to that, you can add the fact that there are parts of the terrain in this region that are basically hostile to the very concept of logistics. You can see on that satellite image, for example, Leshki Sands, a national park, which I imagine is aesthetically a 10 out of 10 if you're a tourist wanting to see desert terrain in Eastern Europe, but about a 1 out of 10 if you're trying to run efficient ammunition convoys. And then, because if the logistics guys are being punished, the troops should too, Kherson has yet more presence in favour if you happen to be playing the red team here. The territory on the Ukrainian side is generally more elevated, meaning they literally have the high ground. So even though the river itself obviously creates a significant natural barrier between the two sides, in any protracted fight over that river, then in any scenario where at least the most logistically intensive Ukrainian assets, like for example their artillery, can remain on the right bank, then they're likely going to be fighting with at least some advantages they can leverage over the Russian defenders. However, it's easy to imagine that situation inverting if at any point Ukraine becomes too successful. The fundamental point here is that moving stuff in volume across a river like this without permanent bridge infrastructure is a slow process, a difficult process, and a vulnerable process. At the moment, Ukraine mostly has to move infantry and some supporting vehicles across the river and sustain them there. Meanwhile, Ukrainian air defences, counter-artillery radar systems and the Ukrainian artillery itself, most of their heavy equipment in fact, can remain on the right bank. Were the Russians to lose ground, however, eventually you'd reach the point where Ukraine would have to move those assets and things like electronic warfare systems across the water barrier, while Russia's logistical lines would shorten and they'd eventually reach easier terrain to defend. So while it might be reasonable to expect that Ukraine can fight quite well close to the Dnipro while economising its own use of force, all else being equal, the more successful the operation is in taking territory, arguably the harder it might become. And operating without electronic warfare, anti-air defences or artillery is obviously a bit of a non-starter, because while Russian logistics in Kherson do not exactly appear to be ideal, there have been plenty of reports of them leveraging other assets, particularly aviation, in order to counterbalance the success that Ukraine is having with its artillery, drones, etc. Now, after the extremely damaging Ukrainian ATACMS strikes against Russian air bases at Berdyansk and in Luhansk, there was some reporting that jumped from many Russian helicopters being destroyed to all the Russian helicopters being destroyed or neutralised. Instead, what we can observe is that while the Kar-52 and similar attack helicopter fleets may be significantly depleted from where they were in February 2022, they still exist and they're still very dangerous.
So in other words, it's the idea that the Ukrainians you want them to obviously get more and more success here, but as they get more and more ground, they will need to supply that larger front line and those burgeoning troops with more and more stuff, and actually that requires some significant logistics across the river, and that becomes more difficult, and they become vulnerable. So there is, it's a double-edged sword. At the moment, they are struggling to get basics like fuel across. They're drone dropping fuel and all sorts. So this is a real challenge for the Ukrainians. Let's look at a couple of sources here. No Reports says in Krinky, a Russian BTR starts firing. There's an interesting one. I mean, it's firing with its autocannon. Looks all pretty impressive. Starts firing at Ukrainian positions. Location confirms that the contested area has likely moved further east. Afterwards, it gets knocked out and finished off with grenades, so that does get taken out, but it is firing in this area. Let's see where that is. We'll plug that into good old Google Earth. So interesting. So if that is in that area and firing, that means this is a contested area, and that has now been blown up there. So this might support the idea that actually it has moved east, the contested area, and that's good for the Ukrainians as they're moving towards Korsunka. Well, Tendai here says, based on Magyar's latest footage, we can assume that at some point, and possibly even at this moment, Ukrainian forces have widened their hold on the left or the south side of the Dnipro River. The Russian attempt to dislodge Ukrainian troops at this particular area in the east has failed. So again, that's exactly the area I was just pointing out to you, moving possibly eastwards. The Ukrainians having here, the claim is, again, it's using that BTR as proof that is there. So that's to say that BTR represents contested area, and the Ukrainians have actually pushed up broadly, Tendar says, just by those blue buildings. So basically they've pushed up to here, the Ukrainians, and the grey zone is very thin before you get a Russian control just over there. So that's interesting if that has taken place, because that's exactly what the Ukrainians need. They need to expand this, and they probably need to do it fairly quickly. There was talk from, as Andrew Perpetua said in live stream the other night, that that's one that he and I, had together. He came on here and talked about his map. He was saying that, a Ukrainian commander in the area said, we need to, essentially double the size of what we have within, they either succeed here or get out, and we need to succeed here within 2 weeks. Well, that's over halfway there, and the Ukrainians haven't taken that much ground, so it is challenging for them going forward. According to Michael McKay, the Russian invaders are no longer present in the village of Krinky, so this is a very positive outlook for Ukraine. Take it with a pinch of salt. Ukrainian defenders are advancing through the summer cottage area in a direction of temporarily controlled Korsunka. Is saying that the Ukrainians are possibly as far over as over towards here, I would think, but again, I wouldn't be too sure about that. That will be over in this, the kind of area actually that we've just been talking about with Tendar. And then here, Astria Intel says, in Krinky, the enemy 61st and 177th Marine Brigades launched a major attack on Ukrainian positions. According to field reports, Ukrainian soldiers successfully repelled all efforts and inflicted heavy damage on the concentration of enemy personnel. So this is to say that in the major sort of Krinky area, that the Russians have done a really big counterattack there. So who knows? Various things being claimed, but I think possibly some good news for the Ukrainians. I think they need good news, and they need to make sure that they can start pushing stuff across that river to support their troops on this side of the bank, and they need to push on to Korsunka up here, and it would be nice if they could join up Podstepny to Krinky here through Kazachi Lahiri to get a nice long area of Ukrainian control. But it is going to be challenging, but it is the right place to be doing it for all the reasons we mentioned earlier. The Russians will find it very difficult to supply this whole area due to the geographical obstacles like the Oleshki Sands and the lack of decent road and rail network and whatnot in the area, and the ease with which the Ukrainians, with the advantage in the range of their artillery, can hit the Russian lines here, or the Russian logistics in the area. Anyway, that's enough from me. I suppose I could say one last thing. I talked about it earlier, but all these sandy areas that exist along Crimea here that had trenches built into them might well have been washed away with the big storms. I talked about that earlier in a video earlier today, but it could well be that these might now be ripe for a big amphibious invasion by the Ukrainians. Yeah, I doubt that's going to happen. Nonetheless, that is all I have to say today for the Frontline update. Thank you so much for your support. Take care of yourselves. Toodle pips. I'm going to go away and listen. What am I playing at the moment? Youngblood, actually, spelt with U's. Youngblood, The Funeral. What a great song. Keep playing that over and over. The live versions of that are brilliant. They've taken off the Glastonbury live versions of that. Glastonbury Live, Youngblood at Glastonbury, was it last year? Well, absolutely superb. Anyway, that's one for the young uns out there. Take care, people. Speak to you soon.